There's only one way to create life-changing cash flow with short-term rentals, and I'm going to explain exactly how it works in this video so that you can take this information and you can buy the absolute highest cash flowing investments possible and get to a place of replacing your 9-to-5 income. This information is exactly how we purchased this really affordable 5-unit property just a week and a half ago that's going to bring in $4,263 of net cash flow after we get the property rehabbed and set up as an Airbnb. It's also how we purchased this 2-unit. It's a main house, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath with a studio apartment in the backyard. And we bought this last year and it's currently bringing in $3,220 of net cash flow on a monthly basis. And I've helped hundreds of other people implement this same strategy and buy really high cash flowing properties so that they can also get to a place of financial freedom. And if you want to discuss whether working together on this might make sense, you can set up a call with me at the link that just popped up. Now, there are a lot of metrics that people reference when they're discussing whether a property is a quote unquote good deal. People will talk about cash on cash return, the net operating income or NOI, the internal rate of return or IRR, and there's lots and lots of others. Sometimes you feel like you need a finance degree just to sort through some of these metrics and some of their meanings. And I think all of these can be useful at different times. I think it's a good use of your time to learn some of these metrics, but I've found that in a lot of cases, some of these metrics can be used by deal makers or investors or syndicators to justify a deal that's not really actually a deal or in the best interest of the person investing in that deal. Like if a metric isn't working, then we'll just pull this other metric and make it look like it's actually a deal, right? And I think there's always some metric that can make just about any property look like a deal. I mean, if you project out far enough into the future, then you can make almost anything look like a deal. However, there's really two things that I'd highly encourage you to consider closely when you're considering a deal. You know, whether it's one that somebody else is pitching you or one that you're putting together yourself. The first thing that you really need to consider is, does the deal align with your specific goals, not somebody else's? So I was recently just talking to somebody that I work with in my coaching program. And in the program, you know, anytime somebody's going to purchase a property, they can fill out the analyzer tool that they get access to, send it over, and I'll go through it with them. And so they sent over this deal that they were considering purchasing for $950,000. And it was a beautiful short-term rental. They're going to turn it into a short-term rental, but a beautiful house, fully turnkey, right on a lake, single-family house. And, you know, when they sent it with an email of some justifications. You know, they said, well, we know that when you look at this, the cash flow is much lower than we initially talked about. And this property is more expensive than what we initially talked about purchasing, but it's going to be a lifestyle asset, you know, one that we use ourselves. It's in an area that's appreciated well for the last 10 years. And so we know long-term, we think it's still going to appreciate really well. And so they went through all these reasons why this deal made sense other than cash flow. And I simply asked him, I said, you know, when we first started working together, I said, what was the goal that you told me you're getting into this for? What was the reason behind it? What's your why? And they said, well, it was because, you know, the husband was working this extremely stressful job, super long hours. He's getting paid well, but he wanted to create some more freedom in his life. He wanted to create cash flow so that they could have more time together because he wasn't ever with the kids, wasn't ever around the family, just always working. And so I said to him, I said, that's fine. You can buy this property. I'm never going to tell anyone what they should buy or not buy, but does it align with your goal? Because you're sacrificing the one thing that's going to get you to freedom, which is cash flow. And maybe you'll even have to work harder now to support this deal that doesn't cash flow if you're not getting the bookings you expect, so that you can have this property that's beautiful that you can brag to your friends about, but it doesn't actually align with your goal. So the first one is, as you're looking at these metrics, does the metric that you're looking at align with your specific goal? So that's the first thing to consider. And then the second thing to look at is, what is the scale and reward system of the person or entity pitching this deal? Because a lot of times you're going to be pitched deals by a realtor you're working with, or by a syndicator who's putting together a deal that they want you to invest in, or by a fund manager. And the biggest thing you need to consider is there alignment between their incentives and their scale and what you're after and what your goals are? Because a private equity company that might be considering investing in two different $50 million investments might use IRR to have a level playing field and compare apples to apples. And that might make a lot of sense at their scale. But the IRR might not make that much sense for you as a specific metric if your goal as an individual is to get to financial freedom the quickest. That might not be the most effective metric. Or a syndicator. You know, in a lot of cases, a syndicator is somebody who is buying a large multifamily deal and they're putting the deal together together. And so they're going out to get investors to invest in their deal. And a lot of times the syndicator gets paid up front a big fee for putting the deal together when it closes. Whether the deal turns out to be successful or not, they get this big fee up front, and then they get equity in the deal for putting it together. In a lot of cases, scale is what leads to being really successful as a syndicator. Sometimes you can sacrifice a little bit of the efficiency of the deal or the performance of the deal for more scale. And that's going to lead to the syndicator getting a lot richer. But for you as the investor, it might be more in your best interest to ensure that every single dollar that you're putting in is creating the highest return possible because you don't quite have the scale of the syndicator. So these are two things that I highly recommend asking yourself as you're considering a potential deal. Because if the goal is freedom as quickly as possible, then IRR might not be the metric that you want to look at. Internal rate of return, which measures all of the return from all the different ways that you can make a return on this deal over time, might not be as effective as looking at what moves the needle today. And that is net cash flow. That's what's going to actually get you to your goal of financial freedom the absolute quickest. And I'm not talking about NOI either, net operating income, which takes out the financing, which again is a great metric. If you're comparing properties, then it compares them apples to apples without financing playing a factor. But if you're just somebody who wants to get to financial freedom and want to be in a place where you can pay your bills with the money coming in from your investments and be able to walk away from your 9 to 5, then the cost of financing is really important to you because that is a cost. And you want to know what's going to be left over in your pocket after all your expenses, including the financing costs. The only way to achieve the highest net cash flow possible on a short-term rental is either by increasing the income, which is the nightly rate times occupancy, and or lowering the recurring expenses. And these are the three most effective ways that I've found to do that. The first one is understanding your ideal guest avatar for your specific area the absolute best and appealing to their emotions the best in your listings. So let me explain what I mean. So when I first bought my first short-term rental, the first one beyond our basement apartment that we started with, right? We turned our basement into an apartment, but I'm talking about our first freestanding property. I was pretty nervous about the purchase, right? Because I had done long-term rentals for quite a while and really understood the long-term rental game, but this was back in like 2017 and I was first getting into short-term rentals and really was nervous that maybe this isn't going to work out. And so I bought a really inexpensive property to start with that I thought, well, in a worst-case scenario, this single-family home that I'm going to buy and rehab really inexpensively will actually work as a long-term rental as well. So I kind of bought it based on the long-term rental strategy in my mind. And I was like, well, I'll just use it as a short-term rental though. And I had been so used to in the long-term rental space, thinking of properties as commodities, right? A 3-bedroom property makes what a 3-bedroom property makes in rent on a monthly basis. No matter what you do to that property, you can spruce it up as much as you want. You can put in all the fancy amenities that you want, but 3 bedrooms tend to just rent for what 3 bedrooms rent for, and you're not going to drive that much more income based on all of these fancy amenities. In a lot of cases, it actually pays you better. You get a much better ROI to be more basic in a long-term rental. With short-term rentals, it's a very different mindset. And I didn't understand this on the first one. And so we came into it and I was extremely cost conscious because again, I was kind of nervous and I was like, let's do this as basic as we can just to test the waters. And my wife has more of a design eye than I do. And she was trying to encourage me to put in more design components and really look at who the ideal guest is, who's going to be staying there. But I didn't do that. I focused more on the numbers and really keeping a tight budget. And it worked out okay. The property was still decent, but I realized looking back that had I just spent a little bit more and thought more in terms of what is the experience I'm creating for my ideal guest for that specific market, which is different than any other market out there. And if I knew that and understood that and created that experience, that property, which did okay, we made right around $1,000 a month of net cash flow on a really affordable property. So that's still pretty good. We probably could have doubled that looking back. because you get exponential returns or higher income, higher booking prices, higher occupancy, which leads to higher income because you create this experience that your ideal guest is going to love. The second thing that really drives up net income is having multiple streams of income coming in on one property. And this doesn't need to be your traditional duplex or your traditional triplex. This could be a single family house with a finished garage. It could be a finished basement that's a separate unit. It could be an ADU in the back. It could be a tree house in the backyard. The key is to have multiple streams of income on one relatively low cost or budget friendly property. And I'm going to show you the difference this makes on a deal that I just mentioned. As I bring up my screen here, you can see this is the deal that I referenced at the very beginning. That is this single family house, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath with an ADU or studio apartment in the backyard. You can see the address there is 1318 Oak Street, Michigan City. We just bought it last year. And you can see that in the high season, the main house brings in $240 on average on a nightly basis. And in the low season, it's $150. And then the ADU is $140 and $110. And we're at a 62% occupancy. So $320 per night between the two units and a 62% occupancy leads to $76,000 a year annually, or after our cleaning fee, about $87,000 of gross income. Then you got to take out all your expenses, which equate to about $3,000. And after we refinanced this deal, because we bought it, we rehabbed it, and then we refinanced it, this is the net cash flow right here, $3243 of net cash flow that we're seeing on a continuous basis because this is a 2-unit property. Now, we're all into this property for just over $200,000, say $225 for this property, right? And so you can buy single family houses for about that same price that don't have the ADU in the back. So I just want to show you the impact of having this secondary unit in the backyard, because if you delete that, and now we've just got the single family house that still rents for a decent amount compared to the purchase price, it really doesn't change any of this. It doesn't change any of our expenses. It just drops our gross income substantially, drops it down to $46,000, but the costs are about the same, maybe a little bit lower utility cost, maybe a little bit lower consumables because we have one unit as opposed to two, but it's really not changing that much. So then when we go back, refinance this property, we're at $811. So we went from $3,200 of net income on a monthly basis to $800. Like, you wouldn't think that there would be that big of a change, but the net cash flow is exponentially impacted because almost all of that income on that secondary unit is actually net cash flow. It's actually profit because your expenses don't change that much by adding additional units. You get really good economies of scale, if that makes sense. So that's the second way to really increase your net cash flow. And both of those so far have focused on the income side of the equation, right? So we said the only two ways to really increase your cash flow are increase the income, which is a combination of nightly rate and occupancy, or lower your expenses. So this third way really focuses on the expense side of the equation, because you can have two deals that both have a net cash flow of, say, $2,000 a month. And one might be a fantastic deal, and one might be a absolutely terrible deal, but they're both bringing in the same net cash flow. So how is that possible? Well, that's why there's all these other metrics, because they help you compare apples to apples. But one thing you really need to pay attention to is the expense side of the equation, because if you buy a property for $2 million that creates $2,000 of net cash flow, that's not really a great deal. But if you buy a property for $200,000 that creates $2,000 of net cash flow, that could be a phenomenal deal. So that's why I created this 1% net rule of thumb that I talk a lot about, because there used to be this 1% rule of thumb when you're buying long-term rentals that basically said if you're buying a property for $200,000, it needs to create $2,000 of gross income. So the monthly rent needs to be $2,000 or 1% of what you're buying it for, right? Because the thought process was then you take out all your expenses like your mortgage, your taxes, insurance, your vacancy, and you should be left with a few $100s, right? And that's considered a good long-term rental. Well, I can't pay my bills based on gross income. So I don't know why I'm looking at the gross rental income. What I want to know is what's actually left over. And I want to calculate, is the deal good based on that? And so I came up with this 1% net rule. So if I'm buying a property for $200,000, after all the expenses, all the set-asides for everything, for your maintenance, for everything that you're going to pay, there should be $2,000 of net cash flow left over. And if you buy a 1% net rule, then almost all the other metrics, ironically, are going going to look really, really good as well, because you're buying something that's relatively affordable and it's bringing in a substantial net income. Now, it's really hard to get there with a single family home. So that's why I talked about buying these multi-units. That's why I talked about understanding who your ideal guest is based on the other comps in the area. And so there's other factors that play into creating a 1% net deal, but it's super important. I just recently bought this 5-unit property that I mentioned, and it was listed in the mid 500s when it first hit the market. And I did the math on it. I ran the numbers and I saw with 5 units, this thing is creating some really significant income because they're all going to be short-term rentals. It's close to a nice downtown area in this town, and it could drive some really great income. And at $550, it was very tempting to purchase this property, but at $550, the cost was too high to hit this 1% net rule that I'd created. So I decided I'm not going to bend my rule. It needs to hit the 1% net cash flow. So I went back to him and I said, look, great deal. I love it. Once it's all fixed up, it's going to be really nice, but I'm so far off. I probably can't even put in an offer. I mean, if I was going to put an offer, it'd be like around $425. And they kind of laughed at me and they're like, we're at $550. We would never take $425. And I said, I get it. Like, God bless you. I hope you sell it at $550, but if not, you can give me a call. Well, lo and behold, 2 months later, they still hadn't sold it. And they called me back and said, okay, now we'll entertain your offer. And how high can you go? And I said, well, I already told you I need to be at $425. If you can come down to $425, then we can make a deal. And so eventually, after going back and forth a bit, they finally came down to my number and I got this fantastic 5-unit deal at $125,000 cheaper than what they initially listed it at, because I was willing to stick to my guns. So that's why it's so important to have a rule of thumb that you live by, because I could have very easily justified the $550 if I wasn't really strict on my rule of thumb. So I'm not against all these other metrics. I think a lot of them have their place for specific deals, but a lot of them focus on long-term wealth building as opposed to the highest cash flow right now. And if the goal is financial freedom, being in a place to be able to leave your full-time job, like my wife and I were able to do 4 years ago because of the net cash flow coming in from our short-term rentals, then some of these other metrics might not make as much sense as focusing on the highest income, which is a combination of the nightly rate and occupancy compared to the lowest purchase price. So again, if this is making sense to you and you want to work with me personally through the step-by-step process of finding, buying, and setting up your first really high cash flowing short-term rental, then you can set up a call with me at the link that just popped up. Thanks again for taking time to check out this video. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.